An accident left him paralyzed and shattered everything he thought he was. Luke had respect, money, and a presence that filled every room without effort. But one fall on a snow-covered mountain didn't just take his legs, it took his will to be seen. He pushed everyone away, until a woman who had loved him in silence for 12 years showed up at his door without permission and refused to leave. What she carried wasn't pity. It was something far more dangerous. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member for early access to the next stories. And if you felt it was truly worth listening to, click the Worth Every Second button too. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing narratives that move you. The morning Aspen decided to show off, it did so without apology. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, the kind that made everything look invented. Too white, too clean, too perfect to be real. The slopes at Highlands Bowl glittered under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the small group from the San Francisco Tech Conference moved through the base lodge with the particular energy of people who were very good at their jobs and needed everyone to know they were also very good at skiing. Luke Mercer was not performing. That was the thing about him. And Wendy had spent 12 years quietly cataloguing the things about him. He wasn't trying to be noticed. He didn't laugh louder than necessary or adjust his jacket for effect. He stood near the equipment rental counter in a charcoal thermal base layer and a deep navy shell jacket, talking to someone from his product team, one hand wrapped loosely around a coffee cup, and the room simply organized itself around him. The way rooms do when someone with genuine gravity walks in. Not arrogance, not theater, just presence, the kind that can't be manufactured and doesn't need to announce itself. Wendy adjusted the strap of her helmet from the far side of the lodge and looked away before he could catch her looking. It was a reflex she'd developed over years, practiced and automatic, like breathing. She had flown into Aspen 2 days earlier for the same conference, not tech, but the Parallel Wellness Summit that had been co-hosted at the resort. She was a physiotherapist specializing in neurological rehabilitation, presenting a paper on adaptive recovery protocols, which put her in the same hotel, the same dining room, and apparently the same mountain as Luke Mercer. The universe, she had decided long ago, had a specific sense of humor when it came to her and Luke. They had met in college. She had been a junior, he a senior, already building something out of a dorm room that 3 years later would become TerraLoop, a sustainable technology company that would eventually be valued at over $800 million. She had been his friend's study partner, then his friend's girlfriend's roommate, then just someone who existed in the same extended orbit, close enough to feel the pull, but never quite in range of the center. She had never told him. And 12 years of not telling someone something doesn't make it disappear. It just teaches you very specific posture. On the slopes, Luke was as fluid as she'd imagined he would be. The group took a blue run first, warming up, and he moved through the snow with the kind of casual competence that was almost annoying. Loose knees, easy turns, weight balanced like it was intuitive rather than learned. He cracked a joke at the top of the second run, and 3 people laughed before he even finished the sentence. Wendy laughed too, half a second late, from far enough back that no one would notice. "He's something else, isn't he?" The voice belonged to Claire, a yoga instructor from the Wellness Summit, who had somehow inserted herself into the ski group and Wendy's personal space in equal measure. "He's good on skis," Wendy said. Claire gave her a look that suggested she wasn't fooling anyone. The third run was a black diamond. Someone in the group hesitated at the top, peering over the edge with visible second thoughts, and Luke said something quiet to them, too low for Wendy to catch, and the person laughed, tension dissolving like it had never been there. That was the other thing. He made people feel like the ground was more solid than it was, like things would work out because he was nearby and believed they would. Wendy pushed off and focused on the snow in front of her. She was midway down the run, carving a clean line through a section of packed powder, when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. The group had been moving in loose formation, their voices and the swish of skis creating a kind of rhythm, and then the rhythm broke. She turned without knowing why. The slope was empty where Luke had been. For one suspended second, nothing made sense. Then she saw the orange safety netting displaced 30 meters below, the snow disturbed in a wide, violent arc, and a figure, still, wrong-angled, face down, at the edge of the tree line. Nobody moved. The mountain did that sometimes. turned a room of competent adults into statues in the first 3 seconds of shock. Wendy was already moving on the 4th. She covered the distance faster than she would later remember, unclipped from her skis without slowing down, dropped to her knees in the snow beside him, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck before anyone else had reached them. His pulse was there. Steady. Present. Luke. Her voice was controlled in a way that cost her something. Luke, can you hear me? His eyes opened, grey, unfocused, and searching for something to hold on to. They found her face. And in the chaos of that broken slope, with the cold seeping through her knees and someone behind her, already calling emergency services, Wendy felt the terrible clarity of a person who has just watched the axis of the world shift and has no idea yet how far the tilt will go. The diagnosis didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. The emergency room in Aspen first, then the airlift, then the specialists in San Francisco who chose their words the way people choose shoes for a funeral. Carefully and with full awareness that nothing was going to feel right. Spinal cord injury, T6 level, complete motor loss below the mid-chest. The phrases landed in the room like objects being set on a table, one by one, and Luke listened to all of them with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the window. Not the window itself, but the wall above it. That specific nowhere that people look at when they're working very hard not to look at anything. The doctors waited. People usually needed a moment, a question, a tremor in the voice, something to indicate the information had landed. Luke asked about the rehabilitation timeline. His assistant Marcus flew in from San Francisco the following morning, laptop already open when he walked through the door, pressed shirt, the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 4 years learning exactly how much space Luke needed and exactly when not to fill it. They worked through 2 product meetings before noon, a board call in the afternoon. One of the nurses made a comment on the second day about rest being part of recovery, and Luke looked at her with a politeness so absolute it functioned as a door closing. The visitors came anyway. They always do. Dev first, his co-founder, his oldest friend in the industry, who sat in the chair beside the bed for nearly an hour and said almost nothing, which was the right instinct, and also, ultimately, not enough. Then the others, colleagues, investors, a few people Luke hadn't spoken to in years who arrived holding fruit baskets and wearing expressions that lived somewhere between sympathy and poorly concealed relief that it hadn't happened to them. Luke thanked each one, told them he was managing, watched them leave and didn't watch them for long. Then the notes started. Marcus delivered them. Short, impersonal, the kind of language that closes a conversation before it opens. Thank you for reaching out. I'm focusing on my recovery and not receiving visitors at this time. Flowers were returned still in their wrapping. Calls rolled to voicemail and stayed there. Dev came unannounced on a Thursday, just showed up at the lobby of the rehab center, probably thinking proximity would be harder to refuse than a text, and was turned away with a handwritten card, 4 words and an initial. I need space. L. Dev called Wendy that night. She was at her kitchen table in the Mission District, working through a stack of patient assessment notes, with a cup of chamomile sitting forgotten at her elbow, gone cold 20 minutes ago. Her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen, and already knew, from the hour and the name, that it wasn't going to be a short conversation. He sent me away, Dev said, nothing before it. No hello. I heard. 3 other people had told her variations of the same thing in the past week. I mean, he physically vowed there was a card, Wendy, a card. He's scared. She kept her voice even. That's different from being cruel, even when it doesn't feel different. Dev exhaled. Outside her window, a streetcar rolled through the fog on Valencia, its bell ringing once and then fading. He won't see anyone, not me, not his sister, not the therapist the hospital referred. He's working 16-hour days and the only person he talks to is Marcus, and I think that's only because Marcus doesn't ask questions. She already knew the shape of it. She'd been watching from the same careful distance she'd always maintained, close enough to the people around Luke to hear what was happening, far enough from Luke himself that she had no standing to object to any of it. He hadn't contacted her. Of course he hadn't. She existed somewhere in the outer ring of his life, in a category that had never been named. Not quite a friend, not a colleague, not someone whose presence he would think to reach for in a crisis. That had always been the arrangement, even if only she knew it was one. But She was also a physiotherapist with 8 years of clinical experience and a postgraduate fellowship from Lisbon's Instituto de Reabilitação Neurológica, and she had spent the better part of her career working with exactly this type of injury. That part was simply true, separate from everything else, clean and professional, and easy to explain. She told herself that was the reason, most of the way to believing it. On a Tuesday in January, low winter sun, the city outside her window doing what the city always did, indifferent and continuous, Wendy packed her work bag slowly. Intake forms, resistance bands, the worn leather notebook she'd had since Lisbon, its spine cracked from years of being opened flat on clinic floors. She stood at her front door afterward with her hand on the latch and didn't move for almost a full minute. She wasn't thinking about clinical protocols. She was thinking about Aspen, about snow, and the terrible stillness of a figure at the edge of a tree line, about grey eyes finding her face in the middle of chaos, like they already knew where to look. She picked up the bag and left. The building in Pacific Heights was exactly what she'd pictured, all glass and restrained wealth, and a doorman who assessed her in 3 seconds and found her unconvincing. She gave Luke's name, her professional title, watched him make the call, watched his expression shift into something she couldn't decode, not quite sympathy, not quite warning. He said no visitors. I know, Wendy said. Tell him I'll be back tomorrow. She walked to her car, got in, and sat without starting the engine. The building's facade caught the last of the afternoon light in its glass panels and threw it back in fragments. She stared at it for a moment. This place he'd retreated into, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces, showing everything and revealing nothing. Tomorrow, she thought, and the day after, if necessary. She had waited 12 years. She could wait one more night. She came back the next morning at 9. Not early enough to seem desperate, not late enough to seem uncertain. 9 o'clock was a professional hour, the kind that said this is not personal even when everything about it was. She wore her work clothes, dark trousers, a fitted grey jacket, her bag over one shoulder, and she walked through the lobby of the Pacific Heights building with the particular posture of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. The doorman recognized her. That was something. He made the call without her asking. There was a pause on the other end that lasted long enough to mean something, and then he looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between reluctant and resigned. 4th floor, he said. Unit 410. The elevator was all mirrors and brushed steel, and Wendy looked at her own reflection for the 12 seconds it took to reach the 4th floor and thought, don't make this something it isn't. Then she stepped out and walked down the hallway and knocked on the door of Unit 410. Silence, long enough that she almost knocked again. Then the sound of movement, the soft mechanical hum of a wheelchair on hardwood floor, unhurried, deliberate, and the door opened. Luke looked at her the way you look at something you were hoping wouldn't be real. He'd lost weight, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed it in his face, in the slight sharpness along his jaw that hadn't been there in Aspen. He was wearing a dark Henley, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and his hair was longer than she remembered. He looked, in a way that she felt rather than thought, like a man who had stopped caring about certain things and hadn't yet decided which ones to start caring about again. His eyes were exactly the same, grey and direct and giving away nothing. You weren't invited, he said. I know. She didn't move. I'm a physiotherapist specializing in neurological rehabilitation. You have a T6 complete spinal cord injury, and from what I can tell, no active rehabilitation plan. I'd like to help with that. Something shifted in his expression, not softening, more like a recalibration. He had expected her to apologize, maybe, or explain herself differently. She hadn't done either. I have a team, he said. You discharged yourself from the rehab center 6 weeks ago. Your team consists of a physician you see once a month and a prescription for medications you probably take inconsistently. She paused. I'm not guessing, Luke. Dev talks. A muscle in his jaw moved. Dev needs to stop talking. Probably. She shifted the bag on her shoulder slightly. Can I come in? He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he hadn't quite allowed himself to since opening the door. Then he turned the wheelchair and moved back into the apartment, without saying yes. She took it as yes. The apartment was extraordinary in the way that expensive, unlived-in spaces are extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the bay that should have felt like a gift. Clean lines and carefully chosen furniture. A kitchen that looked like it had never been used for anything more demanding than coffee. It was also, she noticed immediately, completely silent. No music, no television, no ambient noise of any kind, just the city outside the glass, muted and distant, and the particular quality of air that collects in spaces where someone has been alone for too long. Luke positioned himself near the window with his back partially to her. The bay was flat and silver behind him, a container ship moving slowly toward the bridge. "You can leave your card on the table," he said. "I'll call if I need something. I'd rather start today." I didn't agree to anything. "You let me in." He turned then, sharply, the way someone turns when they've been caught in a logic they didn't intend to walk into. "That's not consent to treatment, Wendy." It was the first time he'd used her name. She wasn't sure he'd noticed. "No," she said, "but it's a conversation, which is more than you've given anyone else in 2 months. She set her bag down on the floor beside the couch, not asking, just doing it, and sat. "I'm not here to fix you. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you. I'm here because you have a spinal cord injury, and I know how to work with spinal cord injuries, and watching you disappear from the world because you're too proud to let someone help you is—" She stopped, chose her next word carefully. "Wasteful." The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind that means someone has said something true, and the other person hasn't decided yet whether to be angry about it. Luke looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the window, then back at her. "1 session," he said finally, "and if I tell you to leave, you leave." Agreed. She opened her bag and took out the leather notebook, uncapped her pen. "Tell me about your range of motion. Upper body, specifically. What the rehab center had you working on before you left," he answered, tersely, with the economy of someone who resents needing to explain their own body to another person, but he answered. She wrote everything down without looking up, and when he finished she asked a follow-up question, and when he answered that she asked another, and somewhere in the space of 20 minutes, the silence in the apartment changed its character, became less like a wall and more like a room 2 people were occupying at the same time. She didn't comment on it, neither did he. But when her hand reached across to check the angle of his wrist, adjusting the position gently, fingers wrapping briefly around the inside of his forearm to guide the movement, Luke went very still, not resistant, just still. And for the length of 1 breath, something moved across his face that wasn't pain and wasn't irritation, and wasn't anything she had a clean professional word for. She moved her hand and continued the assessment. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked when she finally stood to leave. He was looking at the window again. "I haven't decided." She picked up her bag, walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame without turning around. "I'll be here at 9, she said, and left before he could argue. He was waiting for her to quit. Wendy understood this by the 3rd session, though the signs had been there from the beginning. It wasn't obvious. Luke was too intelligent for obvious. It came out sideways, in the specific way he chose his words, in the timing of his refusals, in the particular brand of silence he deployed when she asked him to do something he'd decided he wasn't going to do. He was running a test. He just hadn't told her the parameters. Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. The bay outside the windows was covered in fog, so thick the bridge had disappeared entirely, and the apartment felt smaller for it, more enclosed, the city reduced to a grey suggestion beyond the glass. Wendy had set up the portable equipment in the living room the way she always did, methodical and unhurried, while Luke watched from across the room with an expression she was learning to read, as I've already decided how this ends. "Shoulder rotations first," she said. "Then we move to the resistance work." "No," she looked up from her notebook. "No to which part?" "Both." He turned the wheelchair slightly, angling himself toward the window. "I spoke to a colleague yesterday, a neurologist at UCSF. He said aggressive upper body rehabilitation at this stage has limited evidence base for functional improvement in complete injuries." It was a good argument, technically accurate, selectively applied, and designed specifically to be difficult to counter, without sounding like she was dismissing his research. She had heard variations of it before, patients who spent their nights on medical databases looking for reasons to stop, and woke up having convinced themselves the reasons were sound. "Dr. Reeves," she said. He turned back. "Sorry?" "The UCSF neurologist. It's either Reeves or Harmon. Those are the two most likely people in your network to tell you that. And they're not wrong about the evidence base. She set her pen down. They're also talking about functional recovery of the injury itself. I'm talking about preventing secondary complications, maintaining muscle health and building the upper body strength that's going to determine your quality of life for the next 40 years. Those are different conversations. Something moved in his expression, not concession, something more guarded than that. He was recalibrating again. "Do the shoulder rotations," she said, and picked her pen back up. He didn't move. She wrote something in the notebook. Let the silence sit. Outside, a foghorn sounded from somewhere on the water, low and prolonged, swallowed quickly by the fog. "You know what I find interesting?" Luke said finally. His voice had shifted into a register she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was about to say something engineered to land. "You show up here every day with your notebook and your resistance bands, and you act like this is just a clinical case. Very professional, very composed." He paused. "But nobody works this hard for a patient they feel nothing for. So either you feel something, which creates an ethical problem, or you're performing something which means this is about you in a way you haven't admitted yet." The room was very quiet. Wendy finished writing what she was writing, capped her pen, looked up at him with an expression that gave him nothing to hold on to. "Shoulder rotations," she said. His jaw tightened. "Did you hear what I just—" "I heard you." She opened the resistance band and held it out toward him. "You're smart enough to know the difference between a real question and a weapon, Luke. That was a weapon. I don't negotiate with weapons." A beat. Shoulder rotations. He stared at her for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. Then, with the controlled deliberateness of someone who was conceding without admitting it, he reached for the band. The session was tense in the specific way that a room is tense when two people are both pretending not to feel what they're feeling. Wendy guided him through the sequence with her usual precision, adjusting his positioning, monitoring his form, noting compensations in his movement patterns that told her more about his body than he was voluntarily telling her. He did the work, grudgingly, with the energy of someone paying a debt they resented, but he did it. Then came the moment. It was toward the end of the session, when she was walking him through a new scapular stabilization movement. She stepped closer to correct his arm angle, and something in her proximity, the warmth of her, the particular scent of her that he'd started noticing without meaning to, something clean and faintly floral, made his concentration slip. "You're doing this out of pity," he said. Quiet, almost to himself, except the room was small enough that it wasn't. Wendy stopped. She stood very still for a moment, hands at her sides, 3 feet away from him, the resistance band loose in her fingers. Something crossed her face. Not anger exactly, something older and more tired than anger. Then she set the band down on the table, walked to the window, stood with her back to him, looking out at the fog, and for 30 seconds she said absolutely nothing. He watched her. He couldn't not watch her. When she turned around, her expression had been reset to something steady, not forced, just decided. "Same time tomorrow," she said. She picked up her bag, collected her notebook and walked to the door without looking at him again. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. Luke sat in the silence she left behind. The fog outside was already beginning to thin, the faint outline of the bridge re-emerging above the water. He looked at the closed door for a long time. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. A message from Dev. "How's the new PT?" He looked at the question for a moment. Then he set the phone face down without answering. He was still thinking about those 30 seconds at the window, about the way she'd stood there, not storming out, not crying, not giving him the reaction he'd aimed for, just absorbing it, and then turning around with that expression and offering him tomorrow like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nobody had ever done that before. He wasn't sure what to do with it. Change doesn't announce itself. That was the thing nobody told you in the fellowship programs, not in the clinical rotations, not in the case studies with their clean before and after columns. Recovery doesn't live in milestones. It doesn't arrive the morning someone lifts something they couldn't lift the week before, or completes a sequence they'd been refusing for days. It lives in the smaller things, the rearranged furniture, the session that starts before you ask, the laugh that escapes before anyone can stop it. Wendy had learned to watch for those. The furniture came first. She arrived on a Wednesday to find the living room quietly reconfigured. Coffee table shifted left, armchair turned at a different angle, and a clear path running from the entry hallway all the way to the spare bedroom, which had been converted into a home gym sometime in the past week. Good equipment, she noticed. Carefully chosen. Luke didn't mention it, and she didn't ask, but she made a note in her leather notebook and kept her expression professional, and felt privately something that took up more space than clinical satisfaction. 4 days later, she was still taking off her jacket when she heard it. Resistance work, coming from the gym. Controlled, deliberate, the sound of someone who wasn't doing the minimum. She stood in the hallway with her jacket half off and didn't move for a moment. Then she put it back on, sat in the living room and waited. When he came out 7 minutes later, neither of them said a word about it. She didn't write patient-initiated session independently in the notebook until she was back in her car, because some things deserved a moment before they became documentation. The laugh happened on a Thursday, and it was her fault. She'd been demonstrating a transfer modification, a technique adjustment that would give him more independence moving between surfaces, and she'd grabbed the arm of the couch at the wrong angle, overcorrected, and made a sound while catching herself that was genuinely undignified. There was no graceful version of what had just happened. She straightened up and continued the demonstration as if her dignity were entirely intact. Luke turned toward the window. His shoulders moved once. He covered it with a cough that didn't remotely resemble a cough. She kept talking about transfer angles, but the room felt different after that. Lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, looser somehow, like something that had been braced against impact, had quietly stood down. She didn't let herself smile until the elevator doors closed. Progress, meanwhile, became something she tracked carefully and discussed almost never. His range of motion was improving faster than the documented sessions could account for, which meant he was working alone between appointments, something he hadn't confirmed and wouldn't confirm, because confirming it meant admitting he'd taken her advice, and that particular admission still seemed to cost him something. She let him keep it. The work was happening. That was the part that mattered. What she couldn't put in the notebook was harder to manage. The sessions had developed texture, rhythm. He'd stopped positioning himself away from her when she came in, which sounds like a small thing and wasn't. The conversations had started sometime in the 3rd week, tentative at first, landing sideways in the middle of exercises, the kind of talking people do when they want to talk but haven't decided to yet. He asked about Lisbon one afternoon, a question that arrived without context and landed with the specific weight of something that had been considered before being said. She told him about the Institute. About 6 months in a city that moved differently than San Francisco, slower and more deliberate, where she'd worked with a professor who'd spent 30 years studying the nervous system's capacity to find alternative routes when the original ones failed. Luke listened the way he did most things, completely. No glancing at his phone, no waiting for a gap to speak, just that focused, slightly unsettling attention he gave to things he'd decided were worth his time. "Why neurological rehab specifically?" he asked. She thought about it for a real moment. Because the brain refuses to accept that something is permanent. You give it the right conditions, enough time, and it looks for another way. A pause. "I find that worth showing up for." He looked at her for slightly longer than the answer required. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can see that." Neither of them said anything else about it. Then came Friday. The session had run almost 2 hours, the longest they'd had, ending with a sequence that left Luke tired in a way he'd stopped trying to hide, which was its own kind of progress. Wendy was sitting on the hallway floor outside the gym, back against the wall, laptop balanced on her knees, finishing notes while the details were still sharp. Her hair had come loose. The apartment had gone dim around her, the city outside the windows starting its slow illuminated shift into evening. She heard the kitchen before she saw him. A cabinet, the specific sound of someone who had learned exactly how to navigate a space on their own terms. Economical, unhurried, no wasted movement. Then quiet. Then the soft roll of the wheelchair coming back down the hall. She looked up. Luke came around the corner with 2 mugs in his lap. One black. One with a small amount of milk. Exactly how she took hers, mentioned once 3 weeks ago in passing, as an offhand comment she hadn't thought he'd registered. He held it out without a word, no explanation attached, no qualifier. Just the mug, steady in his outstretched hand, with the particular care of someone who had thought about the logistics before leaving the kitchen and wasn't going to make a thing of it now. She took it. He settled beside her, not across the room, not at a distance that could be called professional, but actually beside her, close enough that the warmth of the mug and the warmth of him existed in the same few inches of air. The city pressed its light against the windows at the end of the hall. Steam rose from both mugs and disappeared. 40 minutes passed. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't the silence of the early sessions. Those had been load-bearing, full of things being held back. This one had no structure to it at all. It was just two people in a dim hallway drinking coffee that had been offered without a reason, letting the evening do what evenings do. When Wendy finally stood, she moved slowly, collected her things without rushing, walked to the door. She stopped there for just a second, hand not quite on the handle, the pause so brief it could have been nothing. Behind her, she heard him set his mug down on the floor. She left without either of them saying goodnight, and somehow that felt more like a beginning than anything that had come with words. The problem with proximity is that it accumulates. Wendy had known this for years, not as a feeling but as a clinical fact, the kind you learn early and file away under things to monitor. Therapeutic relationships develop their own gravity. Spend enough hours in a closed space with another person, your hands guiding their body through movements that require them to trust you before they're ready to trust you. Watching them fight something they can't name and can't yet win, and the air between you changes. Slowly, without announcing itself. The way a room gets warm before anyone thinks to open a window. You can't document it. You can't unknow it. And the longer it goes without a name, the more space it quietly colonizes. By the 5th week, she had to think about breathing normally when she walked through his door. It wasn't one thing. It was never one thing with Luke. It was always the accumulation, the architecture of small moments that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. The way his hand had stopped tensing when she adjusted his position, the sessions that ran long not because there was more work to do, but because neither of them made a move to end them. The conversations that had started in the margins of the clinical work and then slowly, without either of them deciding to allow it, moved into the center. He was asking questions that had nothing to do with rehabilitation. Tuesday morning, midway through a shoulder stabilization sequence, he asked about her apartment. Not in a leading way, not testing anything, just the genuine curiosity of someone who had been thinking about the shape of a life they weren't part of and hadn't figured out yet why that bothered them. Mission District, she said. 3rd floor, I've been there 6 years. You like it? She thought about it honestly, which she didn't always do when people asked that question. I like that it's mine, and it's loud enough that quiet feels chosen, like something I arrived at, not something that just settled over me. He was silent for a moment, processing, not stalling. That's a very specific thing to like about a place. I've had quiet that wasn't chosen, she said, and immediately felt the words land somewhere more exposed than she'd intended them to, because that was the thing about him. He listened in a way that made you say more than you planned. She corrected his elbow angle and moved the session forward. He let her, but she caught the look that followed. Not intrusive, just attentive. That particular quality of focus he had when something had shown him more than it meant to. The physical work carried its own complications, separate from the talking and harder to manage. The gym sessions required closeness that no amount of professional framing could fully account for. She was often behind him, hands resting on either side of his upper arms, guiding his shoulders through sequences that put her close enough that he could feel the shift in air when she adjusted her position. He went still in those moments. Not tense. Still. The concentrated stillness of someone working hard at something that had nothing to do with the exercise in front of them. She noticed. She was trained to notice things, which had stopped feeling like a professional asset sometime around week 3, Wednesday afternoon, one of those late winter San Francisco days where the light comes through the windows at an angle that makes the city look briefly impossible, warm and horizontal, the kind of light that belongs in a different season entirely. They were working on a transfer sequence. Her hand was on his forearm, light, monitoring muscle engagement, when he turned his head slightly away from the window. You did your fellowship at the Instituto de Rehabilitación, he said. Yes. I looked it up. A pause he didn't fill immediately. It's not easy to get into. 2 application cycles. She kept her attention on his arm. Why Portugal? She shifted her hand from his forearm to adjust his elbow, small, technical, necessary, and the change in contact registered in both of them as something fractionally larger than it was. She felt his breath alter, just barely. Just enough to notice if you were paying the kind of attention she was trying very hard not to pay. The director had written work I'd been reading since my second year of grad school, she said, keeping her voice where it needed to be. And I wanted somewhere I'd never been, somewhere that didn't already have a version of me living in it. He turned fully then, actually looked at her. Did it work? One beat. Mostly. The session continued. She wrote her notes. He checked his phone and put it down and picked it up again without reading anything on it, and the afternoon light moved across the floor in the unhurried way it does when no one is watching time carefully. Before she left, he said, in that tone he used when something cost him more than he was letting show, "You could use the desk next time, in the study, if you need to finish notes. You don't have to sit on the floor." She paused in the doorway. "The floor is fine." "I know it's fine." He was still facing the window. "There's a desk." She looked at him for a moment. The careful neutrality of his profile, the set of his shoulders, the specific way he'd made the offer while looking somewhere else, as if the angle gave him plausible distance from what he was actually saying. "Okay," she said. She drove home and parked outside her building and sat in the car without getting out, staring at the middle distance for longer than she would ever admit to another person. Something had been expanding in her chest since she left the apartment, warm and inconvenient, and she didn't have a clinical term for it and didn't want one. She called Hannah. Hannah had trained with her in Lisbon, practical, direct, the person Wendy trusted with the things that didn't survive daylight well. The call connected fast. Wendy was on her bed in the dark, knees up, the city doing its quiet nighttime thing beyond the window. "I need to talk through something." A short pause. The kind that meant Hannah was already adjusting. "How long?" "Since college." Silence. Then, "Oh, Wendy." "He doesn't know." She pulled the hem of her sleeve down over her fingers, an old habit. "He's never known, and now I'm his therapist and I'm sitting on his floor drinking coffee. He made specifically for me and I know where the line is, Hannah. I know exactly where it is. I just—" She stopped. "I can't always feel it. Can you still do the work?" No warmth in the question, no edge either. Just Hannah being exactly what Wendy needed, which was honest. She thought about the session notes she'd filed an hour ago, the compensations she'd caught, the protocol adjustments, the treatment plan that was genuinely good work, the kind she was proud of. "Yes," she said, "the work is clean." "Then that's the line, for now." Hannah was quiet a moment. "But Wendy, you know it doesn't stay clean by itself. Not if this keeps going." Wendy didn't answer. A car passed outside, then nothing. The apartment settled around her in its chosen quiet, and she sat with the image she couldn't stop returning to, a desk in an unused study, offered sideways, in a tone that had meant something specific and unspoken, and entirely understood. She was already in it. The only question left was what she was going to do before it got worse. The session had been running for nearly 90 minutes, not by design. Wendy's Thursday protocol was an hour, 70 minutes at most, if something was worth seeing through. But Luke had pushed into a sequence he'd been circling for 2 weeks, a shoulder-to-hip stabilization series that demanded the kind of sustained focus that left the body genuinely spent. And somewhere around the 40-minute mark, something in the room had changed. Not dramatically. The resistance just dropped. The other kind of resistance, the kind that had nothing to do with muscles and everything to do with the particular exhaustion that comes when a person stops fighting on 2 fronts at once. He finished the last set before she cued him. She wrote it in her notebook without saying anything about it. The cool-down followed in the silence they'd developed between them over weeks, not comfortable exactly, but inhabited, the way a space becomes inhabited when 2 people have spent enough time in it together to stop needing to fill it. She worked through the final range-of-motion checks with her hands light on his wrists, monitoring tension, and he let her in the way he'd slowly, almost reluctantly, learned to let her, without the subtle bracing that used to precede every touch. Outside, the city had gone quiet early. The bay was dark, fog rolling in before sunset the way it did in March, and the apartment held that particular threshold light, the hour that isn't quite day anymore but hasn't committed to evening, the city's glow just beginning to push back against the grey. She was reaching for the zip on her bag when he spoke. No strategy in it. No careful offhandedness. No tone she'd learned to identify as the one he used when something mattered more than he planned to let show. This was earlier than all of that. The words out before the architecture was in place, unguarded, in a way she'd only heard from him maybe twice, and only when exhaustion had worn through the usual layers. "Why are you still here?" Her hand stopped on the zip. She didn't move for a moment. Just held the question, let it sit in the room between them where it had landed, feeling its actual weight. Because it wasn't what he'd asked in the early sessions, those pointed things engineered to make her question herself. This was different in kind, quieter. The kind of question that gets out before the person asking it has fully decided they want it answered. She straightened and looked at him. He was by the window, always the window, always that particular pull toward the glass and the view and whatever it was he found there. The city spread behind him in the half-dark, the first lights beginning to come on across the water, and he looked like a man who had just said something real and was now sitting very still inside the uncertainty of having said it. She could have answered professionally. "You have 12 weeks of protocol remaining. Your compensation pattern still needs supervised work. This is my job and I'm doing it. All of it accurate." None of it the answer to the question he'd actually asked. She set her bag back down. "Because I always have been," she said. The room was quiet enough that she heard him exhale. He looked at her, not the managed, calibrated attention he gave most things, but something without any of that, something unfiltered, the way people look when something reaches them in a place they weren't guarding. "What does that mean?" His voice was lower than usual, not quite steady. Wendy held his gaze across the darkening room and felt 12 years pressing forward in her chest, 12 years of the right distance and the responsible choice and the careful, exhausting work of being present enough to feel everything and composed enough to contain it. She felt the full weight of it, and she chose her words slowly because she understood, clearly, that what came next would change the geometry of the room in a way that couldn't be undone. "It means I didn't come because of the accident," she said. "Not because Dev called, not because I felt obligated, not because I felt sorry for you." A pause. Just long enough. "I was already here, in every room you were in, for longer than you've ever known about." The silence afterward was the longest they'd made together, and they had made many. Outside, the city pressed light against the glass, a car horn somewhere far below, one short sound, then nothing. Luke's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands at the floor and then back up, and when he did, his face had changed in a way she hadn't seen before. Not softened, more like reduced to something essential. The way a face looks when all the careful management falls away at once, and what remains is just the person underneath all of it. "How long?" he asked. "Since the year before you graduated." He didn't move. "You never said—" He stopped, tried a different entry. "You never said anything. Not once." "No." "Why?" Something almost reached her face but didn't quite become a smile. "Because you were extraordinary and entirely out of reach, and I was very good at being practical about it." She picked up her bag again, slowly, needing something to do with her hands. "And then you weren't out of reach anymore, you were just in pain, and I still came." She lifted one shoulder, a small, unfinished gesture. "Draw your own conclusions." He didn't speak. She watched something move through his expression, not a single thing, several, arriving too quickly and too privately to name. Underneath the shock was something older, something that looked from where she stood like a man realizing a story he thought he understood completely had been missing an entire chapter. "I don't—" He stopped, pressed two fingers briefly against his mouth, a gesture she'd never seen from him before. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it." 12 years of practice keeping her voice exactly where it was. "I'm not telling you because I want something. I'm telling you because you asked a real question and you deserved an answer that was actually real." She moved toward the door. "Same time tomorrow." She didn't look back. In the elevator, she pressed her shoulders against the mirrored wall and closed her eyes and gave herself the 12 seconds it took to reach the lobby. Just 12 seconds. To feel the full, strange relief of having said a true thing out loud, after a very long time of swallowing it, the terrifying lightness of it, the way the air tasted different on the other side. Then the doors opened, and she walked to her car and drove home through the lit city with the window cracked despite the cold, both hands on the wheel, not letting herself reconstruct his face in the moment just before she turned away. She thought about it until past 2 in the morning anyway. He didn't cancel. Wendy hadn't let herself think about it directly. That would have required admitting she was waiting to find out. But somewhere underneath the ordinary surface of her Thursday night and Friday morning, there had been a low, continuous awareness that what she'd said in that apartment could have landed several different ways. One of them was a message from Marcus. Polite, brief, indefinitely vague. Nothing came. She arrived at 9. The doorman nodded her through without picking up the phone, which he hadn't done before, and she registered it and kept moving. Elevator, hallway. The door to 410, which swung open before her knuckle touched it. Luke was already in the gym, not waiting for her, actually working, moving through a warm-up sequence with the quiet self-direction of someone for whom this had stopped being her idea and become simply what he did now. She changed her shoes in the hallway, set her bag on the desk in the study, the desk she'd been using for 3 weeks, the one that now had a small groove worn into the surface where she always put her coffee, and went to find him. They didn't talk about the conversation by the window, not that morning, not in the days that followed. It existed between them the way certain significant things do, too substantial to approach head-on, so instead it lived in the periphery of everything. In the fraction of a second longer, his eyes held hers before moving away. In the particular stillness that came over him when she adjusted his positioning now, different from the guarded stillness of the early weeks, heavier somehow, more deliberate. In the way the air in the apartment had acquired a new texture that she felt in her sternum when she wasn't managing herself carefully enough. The work, she made sure, stayed clean. His progress reports were thorough and accurate, and she read them back twice before sending them to his physician, scanning each line for anything that looked like a judgment call made from the wrong place. Upper body strength tracking ahead of the 8-week benchmark. Transfer independence at 70% of target, the compensatory pattern in his left shoulder that had been worrying her finally beginning to resolve. Good work, honest work. She sent the bi-weekly summary on a Tuesday morning and felt, reading it back, that it represented her clearly and professionally and had nothing in it she'd need to defend. It was clean. She kept telling herself that. What wasn't clean was harder to put language to. 2 weeks after the window conversation, on a Tuesday afternoon with thin winter light coming through the glass, and the city doing something grey and still outside, she was working through a manual therapy sequence on his right shoulder. Soft tissue, methodical pressure and release, something she'd done with him a dozen times. Her fingers knew the pattern. Her attention was trained and present. And then, gradually, she became aware that Luke had gone still in a way that was different from every other kind of still she'd catalogued in him over weeks of sessions. His breathing had changed, barely perceptibly, but changed. His head had dropped slightly forward, and the silence in the room had acquired a quality that had no place in a clinical setting, thick and aware, and pulling in a direction she couldn't pretend not to feel. She finished the sequence, took one step back, reached for her notebook. How does that feel? The right question, the appropriate question. Her voice exactly where it needed to be. He turned his head just slightly. Fine. The word was careful in a way that meant the opposite. She wrote something in the notebook she didn't need to write. She called Hannah that night, too late, past 10 Portland time, and Hannah answered with the particular patience of someone who had been half expecting it. I need to transfer the case. No greeting. No lead-up. A pause. What happened? Nothing happened. She sat down on the edge of her bed, the room dark around her. That's the thing, Hannah. Nothing happened. But I can feel something building and I can't... She stopped, pressed her palm flat against her knee, grounding herself. I can't be his therapist and feel what I feel. I keep saying the work is clean, and the work is clean, but I'm in his apartment, and he goes still when I touch him, and I... She didn't finish that sentence. I'm not compromised in my work, I'm compromised in myself, and eventually one bleeds into the other. Hannah took a moment. Does he know you're considering this? No. Are you going to tell him before you do it? Wendy looked at a point on the opposite wall. There's a colleague in the city, Daniel Reyes. He's good, experienced with complete injuries at this level. I'll write a full clinical summary. Luke won't lose anything in the transition. That wasn't what I asked you. I know. Outside, the Mission District made its ordinary nighttime sounds, voices, a distant car, someone's music through a wall. Hannah said quietly and carefully, "You're doing the right thing. I mean that." "It doesn't feel right," Wendy said. "It just feels like closing a door." She started the documentation after the call, kitchen table, laptop, her full case notes spread beside her. She wrote the handover summary with the same precision she brought to everything, which was considerable, thorough, sequential, nothing omitted. A good document, the kind that made a transition seamless for the clinician who came after. She was skilled at doing difficult things with steady hands and an unreadable face, and she brought all of that to the table at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. By midnight it was finished. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a while without moving, thought about the desk in the study with her notebook on it, the mug on the second shelf of his kitchen cabinet, the wide ceramic one she'd used the first time she stayed late, which had been in that exact spot ever since, every single morning she arrived, as if it lived there now. Neither of them had commented on it. Neither of them had needed to. She opened the laptop again, read through the document. Still good, still clean, still the right thing. Opened a new document and sat in front of it without typing. Her hands weren't entirely steady. She told herself it was late. She told herself she'd send it in the morning, with clear eyes and a full night of sleep behind her, which was a reasonable thing to tell herself and almost certainly not what was actually happening. She closed the laptop and went to bed, and lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around her, thinking about a man in a half-lit apartment who had asked her something real, and heard something real back, and had not once, looked away. The document sat in her drafts folder until morning. And in the morning she opened it again with grey light coming through the kitchen window and coffee going cold at her elbow, and she read it one final time and felt the full specific weight of what send actually meant. Not just a case transfer, a door. One that, once closed, would stay closed, because that was the thing about doors like this. That was the thing nobody said out loud, that some of them only opened once. Her finger rested on the trackpad. She didn't move it. She didn't send it, not that morning, not the day after. The document sat in her drafts folder and she opened it twice and closed it both times without touching it, and the fact that she couldn't decide whether she was waiting for courage or waiting for a reason not to, that inability to tell, was itself something she didn't want to look at too directly. She kept going to the apartment. She kept doing the work. She told herself she was being responsible, that transferring a case without proper notice was clinically irresponsible, that these things required careful handling. Every word of that was true. None of it was why she was still going. 3 days after she'd written the document and not sent it, she arrived at the apartment on a Friday afternoon and knew before she was fully through the door that something had changed. Not the apartment, the air inside it. A particular quality of stillness that was different from the comfortable kind they'd built over weeks. Luke was in the living room rather than the gym. He was by the window, the way he always was, but he wasn't looking at the bay. He was looking at the door, at her. "You're going to transfer the case," he said. "No question in it. Just the flat, even delivery of someone stating a thing they've already confirmed for themselves." Wendy stopped in the entryway with her bag half lowered from her shoulder and felt the cold, specific sensation of being seen through something she'd believed she'd kept entirely inside herself. "What makes you say that?" Buying time. Transparent. And they both knew it. "You've been different for over a week." No edge in it. Just observation. "The sessions are still clean. They've always been clean. But now there's something else in them. You're careful in a different way. You're building distance." He paused. "I know what that looks like. I spent the better part of 3 months doing it to everyone I knew." She set her bag down. Didn't sit. Stood in the middle of the room with the bay grey and cold and wide behind him and the weight of an unsent email pressing against the inside of her chest. "I wrote the handover summary 3 nights ago," she said. "A colleague, Daniel Reyes. He's excellent. He has extensive experience with complete injuries at your level. You wouldn't lose anything in the transition." Luke looked at her, Something shifted in his expression, not quite pain, but in the neighborhood of it. "Were you going to tell me? Or just stop showing up one day?" "I was going to tell you." "When?" "Today." She held his gaze. "Maybe. I hadn't fully decided." He turned slightly toward the window. Not away from her, just sideways, using the angle the way she'd noticed he used it when he needed a moment that wasn't quite a pause. She watched the small movement in his jaw, watched him arrive at whatever he'd decided to say. "Sit down." Quiet. Not a command. Something less practiced than that. The particular register of someone making a request they don't have much experience making. She sat. He turned back to face her fully. In the flat grey light coming off the water behind him, he looked like someone who had been alone with something difficult for a week, and had come out the other side of it, knowing what he wanted to do about it. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need the real answer, not the version you give patients." "Okay. What were you actually afraid of?" He held up a hand slightly before she could respond. "Not the ethics, not the licensing board. What were you afraid of? You specifically." The room was very quiet. Outside, a foghorn somewhere on the water, low and brief. Wendy looked at him, the careful steadiness he was holding himself with, the complete attention he was giving her, that had always, if she let it reach her, dismantled her composure from the inside, and she felt something in her chest let go. Not a dramatic release, more like a breath after holding for too long. The architecture just quietly gave. "That it would work," she said. "That we'd let it become something real, and then one day you'd look at me and all you'd see is the person who was there when you couldn't get off the floor, the witness to the worst year of your life." She looked down for just a moment. "That's harder to outrun than rejection. Rejection ends. That kind of thing just stays." Silence. When she looked up, his face had changed. Not softened. Something deeper than that, like a layer she'd never seen beneath, had just come to the surface. "Wendy." Her name in his voice, different than it had ever been before, quieter, more deliberate, like he was being careful with it. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "The first night in the hospital in Aspen, before the airlift, before any of the rest of it." He stopped, looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I wasn't thinking about the company. I wasn't thinking about what the injury meant. I kept coming back to your face in the snow." His jaw tightened. "The way you looked at me like you'd already decided losing me wasn't something you were going to accept. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I put it somewhere and stopped looking at it because that was easier. The room held itself still around them. And then you showed up at my door," he said, "and you wouldn't leave. And I told myself it was professional, it was clinical, you were doing a job you were good at and nothing else. I told myself that for months." A short, controlled breath. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong, and I kept telling myself anyway." Something moved through Wendy's chest. Not relief exactly, more texture than that. The feeling of a story that has lived in one voice for a very long time suddenly finding a second one. "Don't send the transfer document," he said. "Luke, I know what the rules say. I know the line and I know why it's there." The steadiness in his voice was real, but it was costing him. "I'm asking you, not as your patient, not in any clinical capacity. Don't decide what this is or isn't before we've had the chance to find out what it actually is." The words sat between them in the grey afternoon light and didn't go anywhere. Wendy looked at him for a long moment. At the deliberate openness of his face, the particular exposure of someone who has taken down their own walls on purpose, in full knowledge of what that risks, because they've decided the alternative is worse. She thought about Daniel Reyes, who was skilled and thorough, and had never once left a specific mug on a specific shelf, so it would be there when she arrived. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She reached into her bag, took out her notebook, set it on her knee. "There are protocols for situations like this," she said carefully. "A formal step-down period, supervision, documentation. It's not a simple thing to navigate. And your care can't be part of the equation, not even slightly." "I understand that. I need you to actually understand it, not just agree with me." He met her eyes. "I understand it." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she opened the notebook. "Same time Monday," she said. Her hands were steady, completely, entirely steady. That night she opened her laptop at the kitchen table and looked at the document in her drafts folder for a long time. Then she created a new folder, moved the file into it, and closed the laptop without sending anything. Not deleted, not sent, just elsewhere. In a place that meant something specific, if only to her. Not yet. The call came on a Sunday morning in March, just past 8. Wendy was still in bed, phone on the nightstand, the city outside her window doing its slow weekend thing. When it buzzed, she reached for it without fully waking, and then she saw his name and woke up completely. Not a text, an actual call. Luke almost never called. She looked at the screen for 2 full seconds. "Hey!" His voice was different in a way she registered immediately and couldn't immediately define. Not the careful register, not the managed neutrality she'd spent months learning to read. Just his voice underneath all of that, direct and unhurried, carrying something she didn't have a word for yet. "Hey," she said. "I know it's early." "It's fine." She sat up. Light was coming through the curtains in thin lines, soft and undecided. What happened? Nothing happened. A brief pause, the kind that meant something was being chosen. "I'd like you to come over, not for a session." Another pause, shorter than the first. "Just come." She got there in 40 minutes, still in the clothes she'd grabbed quickly in the half-dark of her bedroom, hair not quite settled, no notebook in her bag. That last part she noticed in the elevator. For months she had not walked into that building without her notebook. It felt like arriving somewhere without a coat, exposed in a way that was also, strangely, a relief. The doorman waved her through without calling up. The hallway was the same hallway, same carpet, same overhead light, same slight echo of her footsteps. She'd walked it enough times that her body knew it, but today she walked it without the particular internal organization she'd always brought to it. The professional frame, the managed expectations, the habit of arriving as one thing and filing everything else away. Today she was just walking down a hallway toward a door. The door to 410 was open, not cracked. Open, the way you leave a door when you want someone to walk through it without having to knock. She stepped inside. March had gotten into the apartment in a way winter never had. The floor-to-ceiling windows were holding the morning light like it was something they'd been waiting to do. Long gold rectangles lying across the hardwood floor, reaching the furniture, filling corners that had been dim for months. The same room. Completely different room. Less like a place where someone had been surviving, and more like somewhere a person actually lived. Luke was on the terrace. She could see him through the glass before she got there, near the railing, the bay behind him enormous and catching the light, the bridge standing clear in the morning air without its usual veil of fog. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't reviewing anything. He was just there, in that simple present tense way she'd rarely seen from him. The stillness of someone who has stopped moving towards something and simply arrived. She opened the terrace door and stepped out. Cold air, clean, the particular smell of the bay on a clear morning, salt and distance and something mineral underneath it. He turned when he heard her. Not sharply. Not with the deliberate control he'd once applied to every physical movement, as if managing how he was perceived. Just turned the way you turn towards something you were already oriented to. He looked at her without saying anything, and she saw it. The thing she hadn't seen before, in any of its configurations. Not the neutrality, not the irony worn like armor, not the careful blankness that preceded something real. This was none of those. This was his face without any of that, open in a way that had no architecture to it, no strategy, no layer between what he felt and what he was showing. Like a window that had been painted shut for years, that someone had finally forced all the way up. "Hi," he said. "Hi." She stopped a few feet from him, the railing behind him, the city below, the bay beyond that, the bridge in the clean distance. "You sounded different on the phone." "I feel different." No qualification, no hedge. "I've been up since 5. I almost called at 5. Something in her chest moved. "I appreciate that you didn't." He almost smiled. Then he looked at the water, and when he looked back, his expression had settled into something more serious, more purposeful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being afraid that all I'd ever see in you was the person who was there when everything went wrong." A pause with real weight in it. "I've been thinking about it longer than you know, since before you said it out loud." She waited, The bay glittered behind him, light fracturing across the surface in slow-moving pieces. "So you were wrong," he said. "Not about the fear, and the fear makes sense, I'm not dismissing it, but about what I actually see." He held her gaze and didn't look away. "I don't see someone who watched the worst year of my life. I see the person who made it possible to get through it. That's not the same thing, it's not even close to the same thing." The words were simple. They landed like something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. "Luke, I'm not finished." Not cutting her off and just certain. The particular certainty of someone who hasn't rehearsed anything and is saying exactly what they mean because there's no other version prepared. "I spent years being good at things that looked like courage, building something from nothing, taking risks that other people thought were reckless, walking into rooms and knowing I was the steadiest person in them." A short breath, almost rueful. "I thought I knew what brave meant." She felt her throat tighten. "Showing up at my door when I was doing everything possible to make sure no one would. That was brave. Staying every single day, through all of it." He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. "I was cruel to you. Deliberately. I knew exactly what I was doing and I did it anyway, and you came back every time. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pity." He exhaled slowly. "Because you decided I was worth it, before I gave you a single reason to think so." A beat. "I don't know what to do with that, honestly. I'm not sure I've earned it, but I know I don't want to spend however many years I have left pretending that doesn't matter to me." Below them, the city moved at its Sunday pace, unhurried, unaware, a taxi somewhere, a dog, the ordinary texture of a morning that had no idea something was changing permanently up on this terrace. Wendy moved, not a decision exactly. More like the conclusion of something that had been in motion for a long time, finally reaching the place it was always going. She crossed the space between them, and her hand came to rest on the railing beside his. Not reaching, not grasping, just arriving there, her fingers finding his on the cold metal with the ease of something that had always belonged in that configuration. He looked down at their hands, then up. "I've loved you for 12 years, she said. "Not because of what you built or who you were in a room full of people, because of the way your mind works, because of the way you listened, really listened, when almost no one does. Because of the way you looked at me on that mountain in Aspen, in the snow when everything had just broken apart, like I was the one fixed thing." She felt his hand shift under hers, turning, holding. "I didn't need you to be unbroken. I just needed you to stop closing the door." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then his free hand came up, slowly with a care that felt almost unbearable, and his fingers curved along her jaw, tilting her face toward his. The March sun fell across both of them, cold air and warm light, the bay wide and luminous behind him, and when he closed the distance between them it wasn't urgent, and it wasn't tentative, and it wasn't any of the things she'd imagined over 12 years of not letting herself imagine it. It was just honest. Completely, simply, finally honest. When they separated, she didn't step back. Neither did he. "The step-down protocol," he said. Low, into the small remaining space between them. A trace of something almost dry in it. She laughed, genuinely, the surprised kind that comes from somewhere you weren't guarding. "I filed the paperwork on Friday." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly. "You already?" "Daniel Reyes starts Tuesday." She held his gaze. "I told you it wasn't simple. I didn't say I hadn't already been working on it." Something crossed his face that she'd never catalogued before, lighter than anything in the archive she'd built of him, something that belonged specifically to this version, the one on the other side of all of it. He turned back toward the water. She stayed exactly where she was, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm, the railing cool under her palm, the bay doing its vast, unhurried glittering in the morning light. 12 years, he said. Not to her exactly, more like saying it to the air, testing the weight of it. 12 years. A beat. I have a lot of catching up to do. She looked at his profile, the one she'd known for over a decade, changed now in the ways that mattered and entirely itself in all the ways that had always made it his. She felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, not triumph, just the specific quiet peace of a thing that has finally found the place it was always meant to occupy. "You have time," she said. The bridge stood in the clear morning air. The bay held the light without trying. The city below moved at its ordinary pace, completely indifferent to the two people on the fourth-floor terrace who had just quietly and without ceremony stopped standing at a distance from each other. For the first time in 12 years, he never conquered another mountain, but he learned something harder, how to let someone see him when he had nothing left to prove, and she learned that 12 years of loving someone in silence isn't wasted time. Sometimes it's just the long way to the only place that was ever going to feel like home. What would you be willing to carry in silence for the person worth every year of waiting? If this story moved something in you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like, not as a gesture, but because stories like this only reach the people who need them when someone decides they're worth sharing. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. It means more than you know.